At 3:47 this morning, approximately 12 hours following Senate conviction and removal proceedings, federal law enforcement officers entered the Oval Office to execute the lawful transfer of power. The operational team consisted of 4 deputy United States Marshals, 3 Secret Service agents operating under the authority of Director Kimberly Cheatle, and 1 Federal Bureau of Investigation supervisor coordinating the mission. Upon entry, officers encountered the former president seated at the Resolute desk, reviewing documents. The lead marshal formally identified the team and stated the purpose of their presence: to facilitate departure from the White House following the Senate's constitutional action. When asked to depart voluntarily, the former president contested the legitimacy of the proceedings, asserting continued presidential authority based on electoral mandate. The marshal reiterated that the Constitution grants the Senate authority to remove presidents through conviction, and that this authority had been exercised in accordance with established procedures. The operation was characterized as the execution of a lawful order requiring compliance. At 4:03 a.m., 16 minutes after federal agents initially entered the Oval Office, the former president departed the White House. This event represents a significant constitutional moment, marking the first time in American history that a Senate conviction resulted in the physical removal of a president from the executive residence. The peaceful resolution of this standoff demonstrates the functionality of constitutional mechanisms even under extraordinary circumstances. The immediate question facing the nation concerns the long-term implications for institutional credibility and public confidence in democratic processes. The 12-hour period between Senate conviction and physical removal involved a complex sequence of negotiations and security operations. At 6:23 p.m. on the previous evening, United States Marshals arrived at the White House Northwest Gate and encountered resistance from Secret Service agents. This initial standoff continued for several hours as various parties assessed their constitutional obligations. At 8:47 p.m., Secret Service Director Cheatle arrived at the White House and conducted direct consultations with agents assigned to presidential protection. According to sources familiar with the discussions, Director Cheatle emphasized that constitutional oaths supersede personal loyalty and that obstruction of lawful orders would result in termination and potential prosecution. Between 9:34 p.m. and midnight, 5 Secret Service agents departed their positions and joined the protection detail for the incoming president. By 1:47 a.m., Director Cheatle delivered a final directive to remaining agents: stand down and facilitate lawful departure, or face immediate resignation and disciplinary proceedings. At 2:34 a.m., the last agents complied, clearing the path for federal law enforcement. At 3 a.m., the U.S. Marshal Service finalized operational procedures in coordination with the Secret Service and FBI. The plan prioritized peaceful departure while authorizing necessary force should physical resistance occur. The multi-agency approach demonstrated institutional coordination in executing this unprecedented constitutional action. These events illustrate the tension between personal loyalty and constitutional duty that characterized this crisis. The confrontation in the Oval Office lasted 16 minutes and involved careful adherence to legal protocols. When federal agents entered at 3:47 a.m., the former president was accompanied by 2 personal aides, 1 private attorney, and 1 political advisor. All accompanying individuals were asked to leave the room, and they complied without incident. The former president was then presented with 2 options: voluntary departure or formal escort. According to witnesses present, the former president stated his intention to contest the removal through legal channels and public advocacy, while explicitly refusing to leave voluntarily. The lead marshal acknowledged the former president's position, while reiterating that Senate conviction created a legal obligation for immediate departure. Faced with the choice between walking independently or physical escort, the former president gathered personal items from the desk and agreed to walk under protest. This decision to avoid physical removal while maintaining verbal objection represented a de-escalation that prevented potential confrontation. The departure proceeded through the West Wing to the South Lawn, where a government vehicle awaited. Notably, this was not the presidential helicopter or motorcade, but rather a standard black SUV, symbolizing the change in status. Secret Service agents who had stood down observed the departure in silence. At 4:03 a.m., the vehicle departed White House grounds. This marked the first time since the crisis began that the White House was no longer occupied by an individual whom the Senate had removed from office, representing a clear resolution to the standoff. At 4:15 a.m., the new president entered the White House for the first time with full presidential authority. This followed the Senate conviction process and represented the constitutional succession mechanism in operation. Upon entering the Oval Office, the new president issued an executive order, directing all federal agencies to resume normal operations under the lawful chain of command, officially declaring the constitutional crisis resolved. This directive was transmitted to every cabinet department, federal agency, and military command, establishing clear authority and eliminating ambiguity about the chain of command. The message emphasized operational continuity and governmental stability following the extraordinary events. At 6 a.m., the new president received the first morning national security briefing. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented overnight threat assessments, the director of national intelligence briefed on global developments, and the Secretary of Defense reviewed military posture. This standard presidential briefing, conducted just hours after the physical removal, signaled a return to regular governmental functions. The expedited transition demonstrates the resilience of governmental operations during constitutional crises. Despite the unprecedented circumstances surrounding the change in leadership, essential national security functions continued without interruption. The military and intelligence communities recognized the new chain of command immediately, preventing potential confusion or delayed response to security threats. These actions established clear presidential authority and sent a definitive message to domestic and international observers that the United States government remained fully functional and that constitutional processes had been successfully completed. At 7 a.m., major television networks interrupted regular programming to report that the former president had been removed from the White House during overnight hours. News coverage featured footage of the departure at 4:03 a.m. and the new president's arrival at 4:15 a.m., along with official statements that the constitutional crisis had concluded. International reaction was immediate and widespread. Major news organizations worldwide led with coverage of this unprecedented event, examining its implications for American democracy and constitutional governance. The global audience witnessed the enforcement of Senate conviction powers for the first time in United States history. At 8 a.m., Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer conducted a press conference, stating that the constitutional system had functioned as designed. He emphasized that while physical removal was an undesirable outcome, it became necessary when the former president refused to accept the Senate's constitutional verdict. Schumer characterized the events as a constitutional triumph rather than a political victory. At 8:30 a.m., Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who had voted in favor of conviction, issued his own statement. McConnell emphasized that the conviction was based on clear evidence of Supreme Court defiance, and that enforcement of the Senate's judgment was essential to maintaining the meaningfulness of constitutional powers. At 9 a.m., Chief Justice John Roberts released a brief statement through the Supreme Court, confirming that the Senate had exercised its constitutional authority appropriately and that enforcement of the verdict upheld separation of powers principles. At 10 a.m., the former president released a statement through legal representatives, characterizing the removal as illegal and unconstitutional. The statement asserted continued presidential legitimacy and announced intentions to pursue all available legal remedies. This position suggests ongoing legal challenges and refusal to accept the Senate's constitutional action. At 11 a.m., the new president delivered a national address from the Oval Office. The 10-minute speech focused on constitutional resolution, national healing, and moving forward. The president acknowledged that many citizens had supported the former president and might have questions about recent events, but requested acceptance of constitutional requirements. The address emphasized commitment to restoring faith in institutions and reducing national divisions. The competing narratives present fundamentally different interpretations of recent events. The former president frames the removal as an illegitimate seizure of power, while the new president and congressional leadership characterize it as constitutional enforcement. This disagreement will likely persist and influence public perception. The immediate challenge facing the nation involves reconciling these competing accounts and determining which narrative gains broader acceptance. Public opinion remains divided, with partisan affiliation likely influencing individual assessments of legitimacy. The coming weeks will reveal whether consensus emerges or whether fundamental disagreement persists. Legal scholars, historians, and constitutional experts will analyze these events extensively, potentially providing independent assessment that transcends political divisions. However, the interpretation of this constitutional crisis may remain contested for years, influencing future debates about presidential power and Senate authority. Several indicators will determine how the nation recovers from this constitutional crisis. First, legal challenges mounted by the former president will test whether courts review Senate convictions or consider them unreviewable political acts. Second, public opinion polling will reveal whether citizens across partisan lines accept the conviction's legitimacy or view it as politically motivated. Third, the new administration's governance effectiveness will influence perceptions. Competent leadership that builds broad support may validate the removal process, while struggles may reinforce claims of political motivation. Fourth, any resistance from federal employees or military personnel would indicate incomplete crisis resolution. Fifth, potential congressional action to clarify impeachment procedures would suggest lawmakers identified procedural gaps requiring legislative remedy. Sixth, scholarly consensus among historians and constitutional experts would help establish historical precedent and long-term interpretation. Three broad scenarios describe potential outcomes. The healing scenario envisions public acceptance of the removal, successful governance by the new president, failed legal challenges, and eventual consensus that the constitutional system functioned appropriately. This represents complete crisis resolution. The ongoing division scenario describes persistent national disagreement, with approximately half the population viewing the removal as legitimate and half viewing it as improper. The former president becomes a symbol of resistance. The new president struggles with credibility, and institutional trust remains diminished. The systemic damage scenario suggests the crisis has fundamentally weakened constitutional mechanisms. Faith in Senate impeachment powers erodes. Future presidents may believe they can defy Supreme Court rulings if willing to resist removal, and the constitutional framework suffers permanent impairment. In 234 years of American constitutional history, the Senate had never convicted and removed a sitting president. Previous impeachment trials resulted in acquittals: Andrew Johnson by 1 vote, Bill Clinton decisively, and Donald Trump twice. This conviction, with a 68-32 vote, including 17 Republicans joining all Democrats, breaks that historical pattern. The enforcement of this conviction through physical removal establishes that Senate conviction carries genuine consequences rather than symbolic significance. A president who is convicted and removed cannot simply refuse to depart. Federal law enforcement agencies, including the Secret Service and U.S. Marshals, will execute lawful removal orders even under extraordinary political pressure. This precedent answers a previously theoretical question: whether the constitutional system can enforce its most serious remedy when a president actively resists. The events demonstrate that institutional mechanisms, when fully utilized, can constrain even the most defiant executive. Future presidents will understand that Senate conviction represents real jeopardy, that Supreme Court defiance carries potential removal consequences, and that institutional loyalty to the Constitution supersedes personal loyalty. Future senators now know that cross-party conviction votes are possible under sufficient circumstances. Citizens have witnessed that constitutional enforcement can succeed even when tested to extreme limits. The coming months and years will reveal whether this crisis strengthened democratic institutions by proving their resilience or weakened them by demonstrating how close the system came to failure. The answer depends partly on whether this becomes a deterrent precedent or an example that future actors believe they could replicate with different tactics. American presidential power has been fundamentally redefined, establishing clear boundaries that did not previously exist in practical terms.